All right. Good afternoon, Charles Moscowitz. I'm back for part two of today's programming. And my guest this segment is Keith Whittington. He is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He's the author of Speak Freely, While Universities Must Defend Free Speech, and also more recently, Repugnant Laws, Judicial Review of Acts of Congress from the Founding to the Present. Keith, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Keith, you seem to have a great deal of emphasis on studying the history of constitutional law and politics in the United States. So I'd like to focus on that a bit, if you don't mind, in light of obviously what's going on with the pandemic right now.
Sure.
And what are your thoughts in terms of how the executive is handling this versus the states? There's a lot of controversy around that. I think you have some people, quite frankly, on the liberal side of the spectrum who want national, the equivalent of martial law, it seems to me. Whereas this president seems to be operating under a more traditional conservative approach, which is to delegate authority or recognize the authority of the states and acting as a supporting partner. So where do you fall on how things are going in this situation, particularly constitutionally speaking?
Yeah, well, certainly traditionally public health crises are something that's dealt with at the state and local level. That's where the Constitution fundamentally entrusts the authority to engage in the kinds of measures that are necessary to deal with public health crises is at the state and local level. We have not, fortunately, had to deal with lots of epidemics in relatively recent American history, but earlier in American history, we did routinely deal with epidemics, and those were traditionally dealt with by state and local officials who put in place laws designed precisely to address those. There's still a role for the federal government to play, I think, particularly in this context where we have a global pandemic, a nationwide epidemic. It raises some particular issues for the federal government to deal with. For example, whether or not people who are infectious should be able to come into the United States. The ability to close the international borders is something the president has the authority to do, the federal government has the authority to do, the states don't. So there's some things that you would naturally expect the federal government to be able to do. And to some degree, the federal government's doing it now. But you'd expect the states really to be taking a leadership role, taking the most active measures, making the most fundamental decisions about how to respond, and they happen.
Now, one of the criticisms I've heard of this particular approach, which is entirely within the purview of the Constitution, is that you have states competing for limited supplies, the PPE and the ventilator and whatnot. And even a situation where apparently, I think it was the federal government seizing PPE when it landed in, I think, in Baltimore, where the governor actually had the National Guard accompanying the arrival of it and then escorting it so that the federal government, not to mention hoarders and criminals, could seize it. So isn't that kind of an unusual situation where you have the federal government and the states competing?
Yeah, it's an unusual situation, and this is probably unfortunate in an area where the federal government, I think, could be doing a better job. There are some statutes in place that would allow the federal government to prioritize its own procurement of necessary supplies, which it could then redirect to the states. And so you could have the federal government playing a more active role in trying to coordinate some of these purchases, trying to make sure that some of the necessary materials get to the places where there are most immediate demands in the current situation. I think the Trump administration has probably tried to cede authority too much in this particular area and really encourage the states to be on their own on this when the federal government could be more helpful on this particular front.
And you have, in a sense, the clear demonstration of state authority in this pandemic. And it's interesting to watch how that's played out here in my own state of Massachusetts, which we assume is a pretty liberal state. Nevertheless, it's been pretty moderate here. We have a governor who's a Republican, and we've had essentially the local communities just have a great deal of authority. I mean, Massachusetts is a commonwealth, and that's different than other states in that that means that the local cities and towns have a lot more sovereignty and a lot more direct power. And so you have cities and towns who are implementing things like you have to wear a mask in public or whatnot, whereas other cities and towns don't because they don't have this kind of a crisis. But you have other states like Michigan where you have a governor implementing very strong laws. You cannot travel in a car with more than one person. You can't leave your home. And it's a state where a recent guest pointed out to me, there's only 2 counties that have a major problem with the pandemic. So you have other parts of the state like the Upper Peninsula where they have no cases at all. And you have a governor